Well, welcome back to the third lecture in Unit 7, and we're going to be talking about personality today. But the first thing we have to do is define what we mean by personality. And this is a consistency in a person's emotions, thoughts, and behaviors across time and in different situations. Now, people have been trying to fit individuals into different types for a long time. The early philosophers would try to type people based on a mixture of the different bodily fluids, or these were called your humors. So the early philosophers thought we had these 4 different body fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. And the idea is that if you had too much of one of these humors, then it would throw your personality, influence your personality. So too much blood would make you happy. Too much phlegm would make you really slow moving and unemotional. If you had a lot of yellow bile, it would make you angry. A lot of black bile would make you depressed. Now, this theory of humors is dead, but we're still trying to type people.
There's a couple of ways, quite a number of tools that psychologists have used to try to figure out what someone's personality is like. Are they more or less like hostile? Are they more or less outgoing and social? And one of the ways that you can measure a person's personality, although it's a horrible way and it's not very valid, but it's been used a lot in psychology, is to use what are called projective personality tests. And what these involve are presentation of some ambiguous stimulus, something that it's not clear what it is at all, and then have the person just tell a story about it. So remember, maybe in your experience, you might have heard of the Rorschach ink blot test, where they present splotches of ink at people and have them say, what does that look like to you? Okay. There's another type of example called a thematic apperception test, and this is an example here on the screen. There's an image here. If you were asked to do a personality test with this item, you'd be asked just to tell a story about what's going on in this scene. Well, the truth is it's really ambiguous. It's not clear what's going on exactly. Well, then if a person does tell a story about it, it might actually give some insight about what kind of people they are, the kind of themes that they tell in the story. This older woman is very angry and out to get the woman that's younger. That would say something about a personality of the person that told that kind of a story. Maybe they're a little bit paranoid. Another person might go, oh, look at the loving mother-daughter relationship. Look how much they care for one another. And then that would suggest quite a different type of personality. Now, unfortunately, there's not a whole lot of validity to these kind of tests because they can often be influenced by the moment. A person could tell a different story depending on their mood, depending on the type of events going on in their lives. So as a measure of a person's stable tendencies, behaviors, and emotional reactions across time and situations, it's not a very good method. Better method are called objective personality tests, and what these do is actually measure a person's tendencies, whether they fall into one kind of personality category or another. There's a number of personalities tests of this type that are known to be relatively reliable and valid. That is, they produce more or less the same outcome for a person across time each time they take the test, and they actually do appear to measure things that are important for identifying a person as having one sort of personality or another. A personality test is considered objective mainly if it's been standardized. That is, a number of people, maybe thousands of people have written the test, and the responses given by the different types of people are known, and so you get a measure based on all of those people. What is the normal kind of response to the questions? And then for any one person that takes the test, you get a profile of the type of answers they provide, and you can relate them to the type of other people that have taken the test. What group that has taken the test previously do those responses most look like? And then you can get a sense of what personality they have. Classify them in that way.
Well, these tests are really valuable for measuring these different personality traits like shyness, tendency to take risks, sociability. But the question then is, are there certain traits that are particularly central to who a person is? So some core description of who an individual is.
And one kind of objective test that tries to provide a profile in terms of a person's different traits, the kind of core aspects of their personality, is called the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, or the MMPI. And so they have a number of categories, and based on your responses to just a whack of questions on this inventory, they'll be able to classify you as high or low relative to other people on each of these different properties, like hypochondriasis, which is really obsessing about your health, depression, hysteria, if your tendency to psychopathic deviation, if you're more or less masculine or feminine in your personality traits, how prone to paranoia are you. So you see a schizophrenic subject, this might be their profile, where they'd be quite high on paranoia and, of course, schizophrenia. There's certain response tendencies that are characteristic of schizophrenic. So somebody with schizophrenia should rate quite highly on those types of responses. And social introversion would be a bit higher for the schizophrenic subject. Somebody with depressed would produce a different profile. They'd be high in that the responses related to the measure of depression and worrying about your health, hysteria, and then would be more or less normal for other sets of questions that measure for different types of personality traits.
Well, Raymond Cattell was trying to investigate whether there were some central personality traits that would be consistent in people across time and in circumstances. So he would measure people's answers to questionnaires, but then he also observed their behaviors. Because remember, what someone says they would do and what they would do aren't always the same thing. So he would observe their behavior. And then he would get friends and family to also provide descriptions of the subject's behavior in the past. So he could look at all of these different data points and then use factor analysis to try and group certain types of behaviors that tend to be consistent in people across time and circumstances. So based on his factor analysis, he came up with the 16-factor personality inventory. So this is, are you reserved or outgoing? Less intelligent versus more intelligent? Affected by feelings versus emotionally stable?
Submissive versus dominant, and so on. I mean, rather than listing all 16, the point is that he identified these are quite core and central personality traits, and they all importantly differ from one another as well. And that's the kind of thing that people that designed the MMPI that I just talked about, that they would rely on these kind of factor analysis to know which individual characteristics in a person to get a different measure for each important, unique aspect that goes into a person's overall, personality. Emerging from this factor analysis technique, there's actually been a movement to reducing the number of core traits that are considered the most central aspects of someone's personality. Raymond Cattell came up with 16. Other people have narrowed that down to what's called the Big Five. So these are the big 5 dimensions of personality, and they more or less describe, I guess you could think of them as more or less describing the critical differences from one person to the next. So the first one is extroversion versus introversion. So that just, are you more social and you want to make a lot of friends? Or are you more shy and reserved and you'd rather be alone? So people vary along a continuum of this personality dimension. So where you fall along this continuum has to do with your interest in social activities versus your interest in rather be by yourself. The second one is neuroticism versus emotional stability. Do you a really moody person? Do your moods fluctuate wildly across time? Or are you pretty calm and stable and you don't really fluctuate much across time? So that's the second dimension. The third dimension is agreeableness versus antagonism. So you're kind of a hostile, angry person. Are you more cooperative when you want to get along with everybody and make sure that everybody has a really good opinion of you? So people vary on that dimension along a continuum. And the fourth one is the contrast between conscientiousness versus impulsiveness. Are you a responsible person and can be depended on to be on time, to help out when someone needs you? Are you more impulsive? And that would be a person who's more or is more irresponsible, more likely to take risks and not be concerned too much with negative consequences for themselves or other people. And the fifth dimension is a distinction between openness versus resistance to new experience. So people vary on how interested they are in having new exciting adventures. Some people just want to fall into a routine and they like the same thing to occur more or less every day, and they don't particularly like to be surprised by new types of experiences or new challenges, whereas other people are constantly seeking new adventures and new ways to challenge themselves. So that's the fifth most critical personality dimension. So these are the major 5 factors that go into someone's personality: agreeableness, conscientiousness, openness to experience, extroversion, and neuroticism. And people will vary along a continuum, be more or less, these statements will be more or less true of different people. And that combined, that would go into defining a person, the unique person that everyone is, and what makes them different from other people.
So these big 5 personality traits have been found in many countries across the world, and they're also relatively stable in people across their lifetime. But this is after the age of 30. Okay? Up until then, people's personality is still changing. One of the differences in personality is that teenagers and young adults are more neurotic and less agreeable. But around 30, they become less neurotic and more agreeable. And the other change is that older adults become less extroverted and less open to new experiences as they age. So there's just an increase towards introversion and maintaining the same routine as we get older.
Right, and so that idea that you might have that people as they age, they get more conservative and they like things to be a certain way and they're less flexible about deviations from their opinions about what should occur. Well, that's true. So what determines someone's personality? Well, again, you should know the answer to this. What causes some complex psychological thing? And it's a combination of your genes and a combination of your learning experiences. When we're born, we differ, all of us, as newborns, in how active we are, how cranky or not cranky we are, how social we are, how easy it is to make us feel better when we're upset, how much we can pay attention, etc. All kinds of dimensions. We begin by being different from one another in how we act, and that results in differences in how we interact with our caregivers at this stage. Evidence suggests that these differences in an infant's response, these temperaments, are primarily genetic, and it's these temperaments that will persist in us throughout our lives. Probably if you're more or less social, if you're more social as an infant, then you're going to be a more social adult. If you're not very social as an infant, then you won't probably be a particularly social adult. So your personality as an adult may be dependent partly on these tendencies you had right when you were a baby.
So some evidence about the influence of temperament. So they measured the number of positive expressions. So this would be smiling, happy expressions, by 18-month-old infants after they were reunited with their mother. So imagine, they're taken away from their mother, the mother comes back in, you just measure what's their facial expression. Well, the more positive expressions are associated with higher agreeableness at age 3.5. Now, the higher the number of negative expressions of 18-month-old infants after reuniting with their mother is associated with higher neuroticism and disagreeableness at age 3.5. So here, just the facial expressions of these 1.5-year-old toddlers is associated with the corresponding personality traits that develop later on.
So this influence of genetics, of course, as we've talked about before, that's called heritability of a trait. The proportion of the differences that you see in a trait that is caused by genetic differences between people. So one thing you note based on these studies of heritability and how heritable are personality traits, you find that identical twins raised in completely different environments, so they may have both been adopted to separate families, they're strikingly similar in their personality, and this similarity actually increases with age. So despite the fact that these children are being raised in completely different households, you can note similarities in their personality that actually even increase with age, even though they don't even have any contact with one another. The heritability, if for a number, the heritability of big five personality traits is about 0.50, which means that about 50% of the differences you see from one person to the next are caused by differences just in genetics, having nothing to do with their life experiences. So you can just for each of the big five personality traits, here's just a set of results. The correlation of scores on these different dimensions for identical twins versus fraternal twins. And of course, identical twins are identical in their genetics. Fraternal twins are only 50% identical in their genetic information. So that you note that the correlation of extroversion, neuroticism, agreeableness, conscientiousness, openness to experience is about 0.5, varying between 0.4 and 0.5 for the identical twins, and only between about 0.15 to 0.2, just over 0.2 in the fraternal twins. So that the best way to explain that is that there's a strong genetic component determining someone's personality.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about the environmental influences on personality, and these would include the role of parents, peers, and life events. Now, you can imagine someone saying, well, the way you turn out has a lot to do with how your parents treated you. Okay? Your personality should be similar to your parents. Because if it is just parenting, then you would expect to find a really high correlation between the way adopted children, their personality, and the adoptive parents. Okay? If it's just the parenting style. But in fact, there is no close relationship between the personality of adopted children and their adoptive parents. And one of the reasons is that your personality has to do with more with the life experiences that happen outside of the home. So with people that your parents or your siblings aren't involved in. And this is called the non-shared environment. Okay, so this non-shared environment is going to influence your personality more than the experiences you may have with your parents and siblings.
And this is probably because people have more or less the same type of experiences within families, although of course there's differences, but there's quite a lot of consistency from how families operate one to the next. What really makes a person's life experience unique are the experiences they start having when they leave the home and they encounter people from other social groups and other ethnic groups or not, and the types of friends that they find themselves spending time with and their points of view. So these are the kind of experiences that make each of us unique as far as our life experiences go, whereas the within family experiences are relatively more consistent for all of us.
And this is just a chart demonstrating the contribution of the different sources. So the genetics in blue, shared environment in red, and the non-shared environment that we just spoke of in yellow. And as you can see, that non-shared environment is a larger portion of the source of variance than that shared environment. So it's an important contributor in all of these different traits.
Right. So when you look for genetics as being about at half of the influence on these personality traits, then that means that environmental experiences and the environment that a person ends up in and develops in has to have also half of the contribution as well. It's interesting that almost all of that is non-shared environment with other siblings. So to what extent are your parents responsible for who you are? And they certainly are somewhat. It's not that they don't have any influence at all. But the problem is it's really hard to measure it with these tests of personality because parents are not consistent in how they deal with their children across time. They can vary according to the child's age. There's too much variation in how a parent can treat their child one moment to the next. And if it were more consistent, then you might expect it to show an influence in the differences from one person to the next, but it just isn't. And it's also important to mention that how child raising occurs from the parent, it often depends on the child's personality, even though the parents may prefer that were not true. the child's personality does determine how the parents interact with the child as well. So the child controls as much of the parent's behavior, or almost as much as the parents control the child's development and behavior. Is that going too far?
Well, you might be more lenient if you have an easygoing child, and yet if you have a difficult child, you might be more punitive. So the way you're interacting with them is going to be influenced by their behavior.
Yeah, their behavior will provoke their own responses. So the child's personality, it's not just parents influencing the child's personality influences the parents. And also, it turns out that much evidence reveals no relationship between parents' behavior and their children's ultimate personality during adulthood. And, this might surprise people because you get this idea that all criminals just come from bad homes, and we get a certain safety from thinking that. Well, all you'd need to do is ensure that people aren't such bad parents, and bad people won't emerge from that. But of course, lots of bad people come from perfectly good upbringings, and many great, excellent people, productive and law-abiding people come from terrible and abusive backgrounds. So there's a tendency to place too much weight on parents' behavior in terms of outcomes. Parents are a critical factor, there's no doubt about it, but it certainly is not the only thing that's determining whether somebody's more or less social or more or less neurotic.
Well, parents do have this moderating effect. So if you look at 3-year-olds who are impulsive and aggressive, and you track them across time, as they get older, they're more likely to become impulsive and irresponsible and commit crimes as adults. Unless the parent maintains consistent discipline, they work at forming a close and secure attachment, and they set high standards for the child's behavior. So even though the personality of the 3-year-old might be impulsive and aggressive, it can be modulated based on the parent's contribution, and if they put in this effort to really develop that secure attachment.
So you can see how complicated it is. A person can have a predisposition to become someone that's horrible to others, impulsive and irresponsible, but that the environment, parents can kick in to influence that. The non-shared environment can have an influence on whether that predisposition develops itself fully and the person ends up as a criminal. Or, of course, the opposite. A person might have a predisposition to be outstanding and successful, yet the environment can determine one way or the other how that all turns out. And it's important to make note of the fact that parents are people's first close relationship. So if there's anywhere in terms of someone's behavior and tendencies, the traits they have, especially with dealing with other people, parents are going to have a large role here. How parents treat their children affects children's outlook on the world and how they learn to deal with relationships ultimately as adults. Their belief system, how they expect others to treat them, their responsibilities they consider in the treatment of other people. So there's no doubt that parents play an important role. And we talked somewhat already that there's an association between the attachment people form with their children and the children's ultimate ability to form attachments with romantic partners and make friendships when they grow up. So it's not that parents don't have a critical, important role. It's just that there are many other important factors at play as well. And don't be so quick when you see a child that's misbehaving, that just won't behave appropriately. Don't be so quick just to blame the mother or something. It's not that simple.
Well, a lot of formative experiences that contribute to your personality are going to occur without your parents even knowing about them. So in one study, they asked first-year university students, okay, what is your relationship like with your parents? And these students revealed that they had secret lives that their parents knew nothing about, that they had committed crimes, engaged in sex, drinking, drugs, and they never revealed this to their parents. So they have this whole other life that their parents don't even know about. So in the end, it seems that forming relationship with peers is more important for these kids to do than doing so with their parents. I mean, they asked university students, what made you the most unhappy in your childhood? Okay, what made you the most unhappy? Only 9% of the subjects in this study, who are university students, even mentioned their parents. 37% mentioned some form of humiliation in front of their peers or rejection from their peers. So what upset these children, well, young adults the most, were these incidents with their peers and trying to form those social relationships. So the peers have an important role to play in these young adults' lives.
And again, that's the non-shared environment, and it might surprise people to learn that by the time a child reaches adolescence and then early adulthood at the beginning university stage, that parents are really quite low on the priority list as far as people that these young adults are interested in pleasing the most. So the situation, however, you must consider as important in determining someone's behavior and how they react, independent of a person's natural tendencies. So it's important to consider that even though you might rate high on some dimension like extroversion, or you might be quite agreeable normally, or you might normally be quite open to new experiences, the situation you're in can still cause you to behave in ways that seem to be more consistent with the opposite side of the personality continuum. So you can imagine somebody that's a scientist who's really outgoing and has no problem getting up in front of crowds and talking. But if they come into contact with a celebrity or a Nobel Prize winner or somebody that intimidates them and they think is actually more skilled or more intelligent than them, then that can make somebody quite shy who is normally very outgoing. A person that's really hostile and rude a lot of the time might suppress that and behave quite submissive to their boss, much more agreeable, right? The opposite side of the continuum. However, an agreeable person under a lot of pressure, we see this in traffic, lots of agreeable people becoming quite hostile and angry and rude. We all heard of road rage, very aggressive. Even the most agreeable people can, under certain circumstances, lose their temper and start behaving a lot like an antagonistic person.
So you always have a constant influence of the current situation you find yourself in and your personality on behavior. And we call this reciprocal determinism. And this idea, again, is just that both the environment and your consistent personality traits combine in controlling your emotions, thoughts, and actions. And this is at all times. So it's never a simple, why did someone engage in that behavior? It's not a simple question. It's not just their personality. It's also the situation they found themselves in and their perceptions of that situation.
Yeah, and it's important to realize because often somebody will have a first impression of someone and then base the definition of their personality based on that one event. Somebody's rude to you once, oh, the person is hostile, they're evil. Stay away from that person. And often we don't consider the influence of the situation on the person's behavior. Maybe they had some reason why they were particularly rude that day. You don't know. You don't know their life. So they could be the perfectly sweet person most of the time, but just this one instance, you got burned because of something that was going on in their life. So often we do use reasoning from one event and make assumptions about someone's entire personality, even though it could be quite situational influence behavior. And that's called the fundamental attribution error. And we'll talk a bit more about that when we talk about social psychology. So independent of the situation, or sort of the broader situation's influence, is the influence of our culture on personality. And we sort of alluded to this when we were talking about development. I distinguish between individualistic cultures like Western Europe and North America, in which people define themselves primarily in terms of their individual accomplishments, like their wealth, how much status they've acquired, and they value independence. They like to be the one in charge of their behavior and don't really like to be concerned about other people. This is what individualist cultures seem to foster more of. Whereas collectivist cultures, Asian cultures, Southern Europe, people are defined more in terms of the larger society, their relationship with other family members, for example. And so they value contributions to family and community as a whole over their own individual successes. So it's not the case that there's no collectivist impulses in individualist cultures or individualist impulses in collectivist cultures. These are broad differences that on the whole, the North American, Western Europe's cultures are oriented to be more individualistic, and Asian and Southern European countries more oriented to be more family-oriented, person defining themselves relative to others, more collective. So this is the kind of way to demonstrate the independent self system that the individualistic cultures would kind of foster, where that's you, and you're the main character in a great story of your life, and then everybody else is sort of a satellite around you. That's the kind of idea behind an individualist culture. You consider yourself as the main player, and then everybody else is sort of in your orbit, or they're not. And so it's very defined by you. Interdependent self-systems, those collectivist cultures foster, is kind of the view that we're all part of the same thing. We're all part of the same story. And I know more about myself, but that doesn't mean that I'm not, my behaviors and my goals are not influenced to some extent by all the other people that I'm related to and that I've formed bonds with.
Okay, well, there are some personality traits that are going to occur more often in individualistic cultures, and these would be impulsiveness and antagonism. So imagine you're measured basically by how successful you become, by your own individual accomplishments. So you have this goal towards individualism. So this can increase the tendency of selfishness and less altruistic behaviors. Whereas in more collectivist cultures, conscientiousness and agreeableness are more common, and this increases the frequency of selflessness and altruistic behaviors. But think back to that chart Jason just discussed. If you view your life as interdependent on other people, you're going to be more likely to help them and to think about their needs as well, because all of you are connected.
Right, it blurs the distinction between your needs and their needs. So remember when we were talking about the development of morality, this is where I drew the distinction between individualistic and collectivistic cultures. And this difference results in a faster progression through the moral stages, because these collectivist cultures result in children developing a sense of empathy earlier than children from individualistic cultures. Empathy, of course, being the ability to get a sense of how someone else is feeling, take their perspective on things, understand how they might feel based on some behavior that you engage in. Once you sort of take a person's mindset into your own, it makes you more sensitive to that person and makes you more likely to behave, treat them well, and get along with them. So empathy goes along with conscientiousness and agreeableness as things that collectivist cultures do a bit better at fostering early in childhood. You've got to consider, though, however, the cultural influences don't only determine the kind of personality traits that are fostered by different cultures, but actually some personality traits that you might identify in members of a different culture are actually not personality traits. They're actually a misunderstanding of cultural differences. So something as simple as how different cultures perceive time can result in the perception of quite drastic personality differences in people from those other cultures. So while you might encounter an individual from another culture that sees things in this way different from you, you might think, oh, that person's lazy, or that person's so easygoing, or they're so social. Some of that might have to do with actual different ways cultures are actually organized, and the way that changes the individual members of that culture, the way that changes their perception of the world.
So monochronic cultures, so this would be North America and Western Europe, they organize time into segments, with each segment being assigned to a separate task. Okay, so you can think of a doctor's office. You have doctor's appointments. Everyone has a scheduled time. And punctuality is highly valued. Okay, you must meet these appointments. You must meet these deadlines. With work, this is how it's set up. You must be there, for example, at 9 a.m. You must not be late, and you're done at 5. So we have very strict start and stop times of our different tasks. And we adhere to these schedules very strictly. And if you don't, you get disapproval from others. Imagine if you're from a monochronic culture like North America, and you have plans to meet up with a friend later on that night, and you said, okay, I'll meet you at 8 o'clock at this restaurant. Well, if 8 o'clock comes and your friend doesn't show up, you're going to be really annoyed. It's considered rude or insensitive that they're not there on time. Whereas that might not be the case in other cultures.
Right, and there's these other polychronic cultures that have a completely different view of time, and that has huge effects on how they behave. And when the two cultures meet, it leads to all kinds of misunderstanding and the idea that these people just naturally have these maybe negative personality traits when it does come from just a different way of viewing things in something as simple as the structure of time. So in polychronic cultures, you'll find them in places like Spain and Italy and South America and in Africa. Time is organized so that parallel tasks occur simultaneously. There's no set defined time for any one task. People just kind of freewheel and go to the task that makes the most sense in the moment, and can be working on multiple projects at various stages of completion all at once, and really no set schedule for when they should be completed. Monochronic culture is all about deadlines. When's this going to be done? It has to be done by a certain time. People in these cultures, they have a ballpark idea of when they want to get it done, but that's not really the most important thing for them, is to just engage in the process, and it gets done when it gets done. And also in many of these cultures, instead of business obligations competing on an equal footing with family obligations, in these cultures, family obligations supersede all others. So people will abandon their business projects altogether, or their school projects altogether, in order to support their family. And once again, it's this collectivist aspect of these cultures that influences that. So schedules are kind of loose and flexible, and a person can be late and is often expected to be late, and they'd be shocked if somebody would find that a rude thing to do, right? Because usually anybody else that they'd meet understand the kind of culture they're in, and that when I say I'm going to meet you at 8, that just means I'm going to meet you around 8. And it could be 9 or 10, right? So everybody understands that. Nobody thinks it's rude. So in this case, schedules are considered loose and flexible guidelines for people. The failure to arrive at an appointed time, you can expect that to occur regularly. And I've encountered people from these cultures that are just astonished when you get annoyed that they weren't on time or that they didn't follow a schedule, because it's just not a thing that's valued. And often a person from a monochronic culture can consider and perceive people from a polychronic culture as irresponsible and undependable, not professional, when that doesn't even make sense to the polychronic person. Time is not meant to be organized in such a strict, scheduled way with just deadlines that can't be missed. They can't understand why people from monochronic cultures consider that so important. So that the polychronic person might perceive people from a monochronic culture as really uptight and having their priorities all wrong. How could you ever abandon your family in order to meet some business obligation, for example? So their behavior, though, in either case, this is not particularly fair, because the behavior of members of both cultures just reflects different cultural practices and different worldviews of their respective cultures. That a person gets a lot of their beliefs about what's important and what's not important from the culture they're raised in, and that does differ the world over. So that Although you might think that it's the individual from that other culture's personality that makes them so annoying to you. It's actually just the way that their culture defines what's important and what's not. However, it's important, and I sort of referred to this when I was talking about individualistic versus collectivistic cultures, that these are broad differences, and you can see a lot of individualism in collectivist cultures and a lot of collectivism in individualistic cultures. So just overall differences. Don't make the error of thinking that all members of a culture are basically the same. That leads down the road to prejudice and to stereotyping. General descriptions of cultural differences can be made in a broad sense, but can't be made without also keeping in mind just how much variability there are in the features that are possessed by members within a culture, and how much variability there is in the kind of behaviors that they engage in, their personalities, and realize that the truth is, although you can see these broad differences, the truth is that there's far more overlap in how people are and the things they value across cultures than there is differences between the members of these cultures. So that's it for Lecture 7c. We will continue along with personality in the next lecture.